Hello, everybody. This is the Koine King, Reverend Aaron Franklin Jr., with just a bit of commentary regarding the recent events in Dallas, Baton Rouge, and Falcon Heights, Minnesota. I hope you enjoy it. In a letter dated November 13th, 1787, Thomas Jefferson, then a resident of Paris, wrote a letter to William Stephen Smith. His words, though nearly 230 years old, are still crucially relevant for the present crisis among the races in our country today. He writes, "The people cannot be all and always well informed. The part which is wrong will be discontented in proportion to the importance of the facts they misconceive. If they remain quiet under such misconceptions, it is a lethargy, the forerunner of death to the public liberty. We have had 13 states independent 11 years. There has been one rebellion. That comes to one rebellion in a century and a half for each state. What country before ever existed a century and a half without a rebellion? What country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." If we use Jefferson's words as a sort of hermeneutical lens, or a lens to interpret the ongoing tension between blacks and whites in America, the dynamics can be difficult to discern, given the tendency in a conflict for each side to see itself as the patriots and the opposition as the tyrants. But with careful and objective examination, it is not at all difficult to identify which is which. The actions of young brother Micah Xavier Johnson, the shooter of 5 policemen in Dallas, have been universally condemned as unjustifiable, cold-blooded murder. In order to accept this portrayal as accurate, one must take the cup of American Alzheimer's, fill it with the wine of receding retention and selective amnesia, and drink to the dregs until one is thoroughly intoxicated. In the aftermath of the Dallas shootings, too many Americans, black and white, have gotten behind the wheel of social analysis and race relations and are driving while intoxicated. But every once in a while, God raises up a Nazarite in the midst of his people. That person who, like Samson in the Old Testament, has pledged to abstain from intoxicating beverages. Knowing that friends don't let friends drive drunk, they choose to remain sober and courageously take the keys from those who are inebriated to make sure that everyone gets home safely. One such person is the former Miss Alabama, Kaylin James. On July 13th, on CNN, she reflected the courage of the Nazarite and dared to refer to the Dallas shooter, young brother Micah Xavier Johnson, as a, quote, martyr. Almost immediately, she was condemned and castigated by that cacophony of voices whose breath reeks with the pungent smell of the cognac of the culture. But her critique reflected a sobriety of social awareness which stands in stark contradistinction to the words of our wasted white friends. In English, the term martyr has taken on a connotation as one who champions a cause even to the point of dying for it. But in the Greek, from which it originates, it refers to one who bears witness to or testifies to some reality or truth. In light of both the English and Greek sense of the word, was the former Miss Alabama justified in calling the Dallas shooter a martyr? In a word, yes. For young brother Micah Xavier Johnson's actions reflected the convictions of a person who first acknowledged the historical mistreatment of his people at the hands of white America and resolved to bear witness or testify to that reality, and then sought to fight back, even to the point of being willing to die for the cause. In one fell swoop, Johnson reflected both the English and Greek nuances of the word martyr. So in Dallas, the tree of liberty was refreshed with the blood of patriots and tyrants. But the question looms, whose was the blood of the patriot, and whose the blood of the tyrant? If we leave the answer to those who are historically ambivalent and rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that deals merely with effects and does not grapple with underlying causes, then we identify the tyrant as none other than young brother Micah Xavier Johnson. According to this crowd, America is a veritable Garden of Eden, and Brother Johnson was the slithering serpent whose actions marred the beauty of what they perceived to be an American paradise. They interpret the deeds of young brother Micah in a vacuum, where the provocation of pre-existent conditions is denied, and his actions are universally denounced as having occurred within a larger context of perfect police practice and comportment in communities of color. But if we examine Brother Johnson's actions in light of both American and biblical history, he becomes more the patriot who resisted, even violently, the tyranny of police brutality and social injustice. When we thumb through the biblical archives of history, we come to the account of another young freedom fighter by the name of Moses. Exodus 2:11 and 12 reads, "And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way. And when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." From this passage, we can make few distinctions between the actions of young Moses and young brother Micah. Moses was the son of Hebrew slaves. Micah was the son of African slaves. Moses saw an Egyptian hitting one of his Hebrew brothers. Micah saw white policemen brutalizing his black brothers. Moses was moved in righteous indignation against the Egyptian. Micah was moved in righteous indignation against white officers. Moses killed the Egyptian in defense of his Hebrew brother. Micah killed white officers in defense of his black brothers. In pulpits across America and throughout the world of Christendom, Moses is celebrated as God's chosen deliverer, i.e., the patriot, and the Egyptian condemned as the tyrant. But many of our white counterparts in America have rushed to condemn Brother Micah as the tyrant and the officers he killed as the patriots, though his actions were no different than those of Moses. If all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how can we venerate Moses as a saint and vilify young Micah as a scoundrel? How can we revel in the actions of Moses and be reviled by the actions of Micah? How can we recognize Moses as an agent of divine deliverance and repudiate Micah as an agent of demonic destruction? How can we celebrate George Washington for leading a violent revolution against the indiscretions of a cruel England and condemn Micah Xavier Johnson for mounting a one-man rebellion against the police? How can the sons of Confederate veterans and other white citizens across the South remember fondly Mr. Robert E. Lee and praise him as the chief hero in the war of Northern aggression, but condemn Micah Xavier Johnson for taking up arms in the war of police aggression? My friends, because of the heterogeneous makeup of our society, reaching a consensus about who the true tyrants and patriots are among us may be all but an impossibility. The tyrant will always seek to read from the Patriots script, memorize his lines, and attempt to play his role, leaving the viewing audience in the unenviable position of having to correctly identify protagonists and antagonists. But we are not without hope, for this American drama has been playing out since 1619, a total of 397 years. The characters are very well developed, and the plot is tragically predictable. Perhaps we, the people of goodwill in this land, can rewrite the script and transform this American comedy of errors into a sublime melodrama of democracy, free of despotic delirium. In the aftermath of the Dallas police shootings, all the pundits, politicians, policemen, and peoples both black and white seemed to be racing each other to see who could climb to the summit of peace and claim to be king of the hill of nonviolence. As I watched the coverage on CNN, I kept hearing one person after another say that violence, under any circumstances, is never acceptable. But this, too, is a blatant contradiction to American history. For if violence under any circumstances is never acceptable, why was it acceptable on the Trail of Tears and during the blind fury of Manifest Destiny? If violence under any circumstances is never acceptable, why was it acceptable during the Middle Passage and during the 244 years of the Africans' unrequited toil and during another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation and second-class citizenship? If violence under any circumstances is never acceptable, why was it acceptable in Birmingham when a bomb took the lives of 4 little girls who were attending church? If violence under any circumstances is never acceptable, why was it acceptable for hooded terrorist Klansmen whose methods were designed to quell the impulse to resistance in the black community and to guarantee the extension of a corrupt system of white power? If violence under any circumstances is never acceptable, then Dr. King's assessment of America as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today was without warrant then when he spoke those words in 1967 and now in 2016. If violence under any circumstances is never acceptable, why do we Americans pride ourselves in having the most advanced, translation, lethal, military in human history? A military force in a nation where violence under any circumstances is never acceptable is a contradiction, to say the least. So despite the claims of the revisionist historians in our midst, America has never had an aversion to violence. It has chosen rather to grapple with the circumstances under which violence is acceptable. The question is not whether we advocate violence, but what kind of violence we advocate. The answer to that question is what I call defensive and retaliatory violence. But this too is misleading, for it often denies the aggressive and unprovoked violence which precedes it. In other words, the violence used to settle this land was aggressive and unprovoked. The Native American possessed what European settlers stumbled upon and wanted for themselves. What violence the native committed in defending his lands, no matter how vulgar, must be seen as defensive and retaliatory violence. The violence used against the African to work this land was also aggressive and unprovoked. Europeans were too lazy to till the soil with their own hands and forced the African into servitude. What violence the African committed in defending his humanity, no matter how vulgar, must be seen as defensive and retaliatory violence against the aggressive and unprovoked violence of whites. But now that the native has been dispossessed and the African in large numbers doomed to live on the underbelly of our society, our European brothers want us all to indulge the illusion that they sat down with natives and Africans at the table of brotherhood, and that these respective groups volunteered to divest themselves of their land and their labor, and then we all sang Kumbaya and lived happily ever after. Once again, we hear the voice of the tyrant reciting the Patriots' lines. The persistent denial of black humanity on the part of whites explains the guilt that the former Miss Alabama and millions of other blacks across the nation have about not feeling sorry for the 5 officers who were killed, in spite of having an undeniable respect for the dignity and worth of human life. She was just honest enough to admit the rupture in her psyche and spirit. But I ask, how else is she to feel? How else is the black community to feel? Can we reasonably be expected to share in the pathos of those who alienate the African from rights, which are identified in America's document of freedom as inalienable? When black males in America in 2016 are still being haunted by words eerily reminiscent of the Dred Scott decision of 1857, that a black man has no rights which a white man, or more specifically, a white police officer, is bound to respect, how can we empathize with the suffering of grieving white families when there is no empathy to be found for the suffering of grieving black families each time one of their sons is exterminated like a fly buzzing around at a picnic table? If blacks appear to be advocates of violence against those white officers in Dallas, it is because our white counterparts consistently and apathetically turn a blind eye and a deaf ear to the violence their brothers in blue commit against blacks. There has been a concerted effort by the mainstream media to portray Brother Micah as someone who was radicalized. They sought to connect his actions to the rhetoric of various online groups which are sympathetic to the black cause. They contend that the Black Lives Matter movement and other Afrocentric and black nationalist groups are hate groups. But none of these groups had their beginnings in some past utopia of American racial equality. From our historically black colleges and universities to our black churches, from our black fraternities and sororities to the NAACP, from the SELC to SNCC, from the Black Panther Party to the Black Lives Matter movement, each of these so-called hate groups was founded in response to an American dystopia of racial discrimination and inequality. For our white counterparts to persist in transmuting the nobility of self-defense, self-determination, and self-preservation into the barbarity of unprovoked aggression on the part of blacks is to see the inveterate arrogance and myopic self-righteousness which has made America the perennial object of hatred by men the world over. If the coverage by CNN is any indication, Black Lives Matter only parenthetically. For when black men were killed in Baton Rouge and in Minnesota on successive days, the media rightly focused its spotlight upon those tragedies. Then the officers were ambushed and killed in Dallas, and without so much as a hiccup, the murders of 2 black men at the hands of white, trigger-happy policemen became a footnote in yesterday's news. If all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what makes the life of a police officer more valuable than the lives of the citizens they are sworn to protect and serve? Why erect a veritable pyramid of media coverage in Dallas after having concocted a makeshift antbed of attention in Louisiana and in Minnesota? Why did the president go only to Dallas and not to Baton Rouge and Minnesota? It is because there are unmolested epistemological assumptions, that is, assumptions in our perception, operating quietly beneath the surface of the nation, teaching us to abide by an unspoken hierarchy of human value based upon some criterion other than having been made in the image of Almighty God. But if we unwisely profess all policemen to be paragons of virtue and tacitly assume the nation's citizens of color to be prisoners of vice, if we establish a policy in the U.S. where the life of the police officer becomes sacrosanct and his actions, no matter how reckless, are catapulted to a place beyond the scrutiny of his peers so that he is always justified and his victims vilified, we run the risk of creating and maintaining a menace to society. As Lord Acton wisely said in a letter to Bishop Mandel Creighton in 1887, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. Lord Acton was surely right, but he failed to mention that power not only corrupts good men, but it also tends to attract evil men. I can think of few occupations where men enjoy as much power as do police officers. If power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, we must place power beyond the reach of otherwise impotent individuals who are seeking to become vigilantes vested with the sanction of the state. Here, the wisdom of the insurance industry is instructive. In his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, G. Edward Griffin states, one of the primary conditions of insurance is that it must avoid what underwriters call moral hazard. That is, a situation in which the policyholder has little incentive to avoid or prevent that which is being insured against. When moral hazard is present, it is normal for people to become careless, and the likelihood increases that what is being insured against will actually happen. Giving men and women the power to be judge, jury, and executioner is enough to flirt with moral hazard. But when power is conferred, abused, exonerated, and then restored without exception, year after year after year, moral hazard is exacerbated. As a result, more corrupt officers are emboldened to abuse their power, and more evil men are drawn to the occupation in hopes that they too will someday be able to get away with murder. If we continue this present course, I am afraid we will have chosen not the option of living together as brothers, but rather the end of perishing together as fools. Whenever we see episodes of mass killings involving gun violence, our pachydermian pals on the right side of the political aisle rush in to tell us that the problem with our nation is not the presence of guns, but guns in the hands of the mentally deranged. But this is misleading at best and diabolically dishonest at worst. Consider the following example. While it may be true that whenever it is raining there are clouds in the sky, it does not follow that wherever there are clouds in the sky, it is raining. The same logic applies to gun violence. While it may be true that the mentally deranged are sometimes the perpetrators of violence, it does not follow that gun violence is always perpetrated by the mentally deranged. The beautiful yet thin veneer of civility in our nation is often sanded through to reveal the ugly and cheap substrate at the core of the nation's identity: anger. If America is the land of the free and the home of the brave, it must also admit to being the abode of the angry. Without question, America is that place where, in the words of the late Dr. C.A.W. Clarke, we have been forced to live together before we were fit to live with. So despite the Republicans' appeal to the contrary, the question before the nation is not so much how we can keep guns out of the hands of the mentally deranged, but how we can keep guns out of the hands of the angry. The answer to this question may well prove to be disastrously elusive, for unmolested anger in America, like the Zika virus in Brazil, shrinks the cranial capacity of its victims, making lucid and logical thought an impossibility, and violent outbursts an inevitability. Yet our Republican friends continue to insist that an armed America is a safer America. Given the nation's present context as a powder keg of anger, only a fool would suggest that everyone enter the armory carrying a lit match. Likewise, it is nothing short of irresponsible and suicidal for the present architects of American society to unqualifiedly affirm the Second Amendment as a sacred right for every citizen to bear arms, where those same citizens are increasingly becoming disciples of the disarmament of civility and compassion. If this period in our history is genuinely a watershed moment, and we have an opportunity to transform our land into one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, then let us abandon the pretensions which have cast us into the pit of impending disaster, and embrace that rope of truth by which both men and nations have climbed out of the abyss and into the valley of unfamed humanity. I leave you with the words of the Apostle Paul to the Romans, "The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof." This is my hope, and this is my prayer.